this panel, we'll be talking with three full-time ministers, actually pulpit ministers of Churches of Christ in various size cities and locations. Jarrod Robinson, been in ministry about 15 years. He's currently the pulpit minister at Southern Hills Church of Christ here in Abilene. Came from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Nickerson's been in ministry about 15 years. Recently appointed pulpit minister at the Menda Street Church of Christ here in Abilene. David Bearden. David and I noticed that we put the youngsters in between us. David's been in ministry about 40 years. A long time in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he's now pulpit minister at the Graham Street Church of Christ in Stephenville. Let me start by asking each one of you, it doesn't really matter which order you go in, you've seen a lot of ministry in your days, and you've seen a lot of examples. What's a quick thing that you've seen that really plays into what we're saying in this whole workshop here? I don't mean what works in a very pragmatic way, but what kind of things have you seen happen that have brought spiritual success to a congregation?
I think when a church is able to move beyond thinking about its own survival to the community that it's placed in, I think God has created the church in such a way that when it focuses only on its own survival, it's not the church. The church is intended to be a gift to the world and to be a witness, a symbol, as Randy said, of the kingdom breaking in. And so when churches are able, I think, to stop focusing just on themselves and their own future, but they're trying to usher in God's preferred future for their neighborhood or for their community, and without separating that from I'm not trying to say that we only focus on what we can do actively in the neighborhood in terms of meeting needs. But when we're able to connect that with the broader good news of the gospel, it brings new life. It brings new possibilities. It starts different conversations that aren't only about possibly nostalgia or preferences that people have when they come to church. And when a horizon can explode again to be the broader mission of God, I think there's new hope that gets experienced.
I think a similar idea that if a church can think of worship as more than just Sunday morning, that every day of our lives, every hour of our lives is worship, and we can begin to do that as a community, that our worship to God is our service in the community, our love for people, our love for one another, and how we demonstrate that in the world, that when we begin to live that out, and the focus is not just about what you do on Sunday morning, but it's a broad perspective of being that light in the world. It makes all the difference in the world, in the community that you live in, but it goes way beyond that. It influences everything that you do.
So you mentioned the word being focused, being intentional about maintaining the focus on the mission of the church, and equipping individuals to do that work of the ministry. What I've seen is when you're intentional about the mission and you're intentional about spiritual growth and development, people living out their Christianity in the world, it makes a difference for that congregation and the community that is within.
We've had, some of you got this recommendation. If you didn't, you might write this down. This book by Todd Bolsinger, Bolsinger, called Canoeing the Mountains. Isn't that an interesting title? He uses the metaphor of Lewis and Clark expedition. They got to a certain point on the western frontier at the time, thinking they would carry their canoes a few miles and then put them in the Columbia River and float to the Pacific Ocean. What they discovered when they got to the top of the mountain was the Rocky Mountains. And they had to totally change their strategy. They got there, but it was nowhere like what they thought. And I thought, what a great metaphor that is for these times. In fact, he says a very arresting statement in there. He says, the world ahead of you is nothing like the world behind you. And so that adds a little weight to our discussion and to our seminar. And so what we're trying to figure out, in Lewis and Clark fashion, we're not sure that getting the canoes over the hill is going to be the answer to all of our problems. We're going to have to rethink a lot of things. And what Randy said in a previous session, they're beginning to talk about, and what Carson and his panel said, we're talking about essentials that you must have, that you must preserve no matter what else changes around you. Bolsinger also talks about individual congregations having kind of a DNA, which means out of all of these congregations represented, all of yours, no two are alike. So, first of all, do you guys buy this, that a church kind of has a DNA and it operates best when it kind of stays in that? I mean, is that a strength or is there a problem connected to that?
Well, I'll stab at that first. Yes and no, I agree with that. Now, I've been in a lot of places. After I left graduate school, I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I went to St. Louis, Missouri, the state of Washington. I was in Southern California, Los Angeles area, back to St. Louis, and then Tuscaloosa, Alabama, working with churches oftentimes that were going through trauma and healing and so forth. I would say it's true. Every one of those congregations were completely different. At the same time, I don't know that they're restrained to keep that completely. And the reason why I say that is 3 times I've worked with church mergers. And one of the things that you have to do in dealing with a merger is have the 2 church leaderships sit down together and say, okay, what will we do if we merge? And what are we willing to say we don't have to have that we've had from the past? And we can do together, and we can agree to do together. So what you're doing in essence is saying we're changing the DNA. Now you're always taking parts from those 2 churches, but you're coming out on the other side trying to be a brand new congregation. If you don't, then you haven't had a successful merger.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think it's true to a limit, but I think if we feel like it keeps us from making the changes we need to make, then we're holding too hard and fast to that DNA.
Okay. Brother Ian, you're so helpful.
Yeah, I've never been a part of a church merger personally, but I do think in working, and this is my 3rd church to really work full-time at Southern Hills. And yeah, obviously churches have not just personalities and not just cultures, but they also have stories from the past that you hear told over and over again. And it's a way of you finding out this is the church's self-understanding. And when a church has, especially for most of our churches, almost all of us are either going to or ministering in churches that used to be bigger. And if they're tied to that American success narrative that we've talked about, you're going to be dealing with a fair amount of nostalgia. And it's not going to be stories about you as the new minister or the new member or the new church leader. It's going to be some time in recent past enough for people to remember it, where they're going to talk about, don't you love it when we were able to talk about this time in our church life, or when we had this ministry going, or when we were doing these things. And one of the things that I think is important is to find the core in those stories of what is it about it that is most tied to the mission of God. And can you hold on to those parts of the story and say, well, let's live out those kinds of stories again. But I think a mistake is to try to recreate in great detail things that used to happen, that used to be, I guess in a lot of ways, easier or simpler, or at least they seemed that way, and try to drag a church backwards to a place and a time that you can't really recreate, and the church can't recreate. When you do that, you can't, it doesn't work.
Well, there's some old paths that the Bible talks about, and I'm one who believes that you should remember the old paths, but you can walk those old paths with some new shoes.
Yep.
Right? We don't have to do the same things the same way. You learn to do things differently, but you never forget the history. You never forget your legacy, and which is almost simultaneously saying you're standing on the shoulders of those who came before you, and there was some success there that you can learn from and glean from and create your own success. And hopefully those who came before us had a vision that was big enough, what God is doing, a vision that's big enough that those who are coming on behind them can partner in that same vision and take it even further.
You know, that reminds me, Ian, there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and that is it's a principle of what is called systems theory. Systems theory in its simplest form means what affects one part of the system affects all the system. A family is a system. We have biological systems. We have mechanical systems. You'll get in a mechanical system when you drive away from here tonight. There are social systems. And one of the characteristics we found about a social system is it resists change. And so a system, when left alone, will strive to stay the same.
For various reasons. One,
Yeah.
You resist change because maybe it means I'm gonna have to do more work.
Yeah.
And if we change, then you mean I have to go out and teach somebody the gospel? All right. That in the past, the preacher did that, or the elder did that. We resist change because I'm not going to get to do more work. All right. I thought if we change, then I'll get to be the big cheese in the group, and that's not the case anymore. Or sometimes change means nothing. I wasn't doing anything in the first place, so I'm gonna keep not doing anything.
First of all, does everybody, David, do you buy into this idea that the natural tendency is to keep things the same?
Well, we all have habits, and they're comfortable for us.
Yeah.
You know, in our individual lives. You know, and if you put your toothbrush in the same place in the bathroom every day, and it's in a different place.
Yeah.
You know, that makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You can imagine what it is in a whole
That
system.
happened to me last week, yes.
Yeah. And you're sure
With
it's
my
because you
toothbrush.
forgot, you know. But,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, if the whole system is changing, that's frightening for everyone involved.
Yeah, the other thing, too, about a congregation, a lot of the things we're talking about, not only the congregational system, but all these systems around us are changing. And therefore, it's putting renewed pressure on the church, and just so that all change is not good, all change is not bad either. So, how do you balance that out?
It's more easily received, I believe, when the church is prepared for the change. Mentor Street, for example.
Yeah.
We have gone through a transformation in our congregation. I just became the minister about close to 3 years ago. But that process of transformation, that transition, started and was made known years in advance.
Yeah.
So there was a continual indoctrination and preparedness for the congregation that made that change a lot better.
Jarrod?
Yeah, and I think one of the hardest things, both in families and church families, is even when you recognize that the current state of things might be toxic or unhealthy, understanding that or knowing that or talking about that doesn't make the change any easier to make. I mean, even if you decide this isn't working for us, or we're not effectively reaching people the way we want to, you know, somebody is very comfortable, maybe a majority of people are very comfortable in a church with the way things are, even when they say they want change. Going through the energy of making that change can be difficult.
How about this little saying, react to this. For a church to be alive and to thrive, everybody has to give up something. I guarantee these guys that they would have a job after this panel. So if they develop throat trouble, just go with the flow.
It's absolutely true. I don't know that that's the best way to advertise change. You know, I mean, you start off that way and you scare everyone to begin with. But I do think you can help people experience the reality of that as they begin to get ready for anything that's coming up. And I think it's important that we help people get ready for any change that we're going to do and help them to realize that that's part of the life process that we're in. And it's certainly part of the process of transformation.
Back
So
to
we
what Ian was saying, the preparation. And you got to reorient. Yeah.
Bolsinger, didn't he say that, if something to this effect, that as a leader, if they're not going to follow you on the mapped out area, then they're not going to follow you where it's unmapped.
They're not going to follow you off the map.
Yeah.
That's back to the Lewis and Clark deal. Lewis and Clark had such credibility with their team that when they totally changed the plans in the middle of the continent, everybody went with them. And that's a kind of a radical illustration, but don't you feel sometime in a local congregation that somebody has totally changed the plans, the itinerary, the goal, the mission, the target, whatever you would call it? Right, Jarrod?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think what's difficult in this too is that, if there's so much change going on in the world around everyone, they're deeply longing for one place to not change. And so then they overreact to changes in the church that leaders might anticipate going in. This isn't that big of a change. But if you've ever tried to change the paint color in your auditorium, you realize that part of that reaction is, I can't control my own family. I can't control things that are going on at work. I can't control my health. I can't control I can't control the culture around us. But I don't want the paint color to change at church.
So my church,
one place that doesn't change.
It becomes the default, changeless thing. You guys,
for a lot of people, church is their comfort zone. That's why they're there. At the same time, I don't know that that's the mission of Christ. And the mission has to trump that. And somehow we have to help people understand the mission is more important than my comfort. And trying to do that is difficult. I think, we talk a lot about mission statements and things like that. Right now at the church where I am, it's real simple, just rooted, growing, reaching. And helping people understand what it means to be rooted. And that's not just about rooted in the Word and rooted in Christ, but it's helping people be rooted in their lives well enough that they're stable enough that they can move into the growing and the reaching. And that everybody is to be a part of that. And the church will be what God wants it to be if we can, and people buy into that, then losing a little bit of your comfort to help people go through that is not as scary. But if you don't buy into that, changing people's comfort is the worst thing you can do to
if you don't have a good sense of rootedness first. So back to what you were saying, Ian.
You're utilizing the word rootedness, and I thought about, it's not about you, it's not about, it's not about me, it's about the mission, it's about him. And a lot of this, even the changing of the paint, a lot of this is spiritual immaturity. We just have a lot of spiritual immature people in our congregations. Can I say that?
Well, I didn't say it, and I didn't ask it.
We have a lot of spiritual immature Christians in the church.
Yeah.
People have been in church for 10, 15, 30 years who just have not grown up. Yeah. And we continue to cater to their childlikeness or their carnality, right? And so they get upset, so they move to another congregation, they stop giving. It's just a sign of spiritual immaturity, and we got to begin to help people to grow up.
Back to some of the stuff in this book and some other authors I've read, we'll call it the squeaky wheel syndrome. If congregational leaders only respond to the complainer, let's just say, then they have handed control to the complainer. But it's that kind of brings up another thing. Let's talk about for a minute: resistance. Because when we do go forward with practically anything in the church, are you guys, any of you guys, familiar with resistance? don't all jump in at the same time.
Well, I'll give an illustration. We're talking about being more community-minded, being more involved in the community. We have several ministries that deal with that. For example, basic needs, which is meeting people's basic needs in life for food, clothing, shelter. It's a great ministry. And we say, that's something that we need to help the community know that's part of our identity, that we serve and love. Celebrate Recovery, is another one. The Homeless Coalition, different things that we're involved in. Okay, so people are real excited about the idea of being known for that. But there's two areas of resistance. One is, that means I have to work. And I have to work with people often that I'm not comfortable in working with. And secondly, when you start reaching them and they start becoming a part of our family, they're not exactly like us,
Yeah.
And, for example, we baptized a couple of people just a few weeks ago. And they were living in a RV that didn't run, parked at a trailer lot that, obviously they were different. And yet they kept saying, this is the first time in my life that I have found family. So we took that before the church and said, look, this is the impression that you've made on people. They have found family in us. And I think it breaks down some of that resistance because you see that you're doing more than just giving a handout. You're helping people find something that they've never found before. And they've found family and they've found the Lord, and it's made their life better. And it begins to break, it chips away at that resistance.
And that's something worth fighting for. But there are some things that people are resistant against that you just need to leave it alone. Now is not the time. If you can't convince them that this is the time and this is why, and indoctrinate them, sometimes as younger preachers, I'm a younger preacher. Sometimes as younger preachers, we try to force our way because we got these new ideas and we got on these new shoes going down this old path. It doesn't mean that you have to push your way through everything. Sometimes you just got to wait and be patient.
Okay.
Now, I will say, I think part of the challenge with resistance is when you have lots of church choices, once somebody's disappointed or frustrated, they get angry and they know that the first thing they can do to an anxious elder or minister is to say, if I don't get my way, I'm going to leave. And I think one of the difficulties there especially is I have found that while we often use family language to describe church, most members would rather be treated as a customer or a client than a son or a daughter. Because in families, we're not customers and clients who demand our way and get our way, and that's how it's going to go. But I'm telling you, in terms of the way people react to change at church, from the sense of who we are shifting in new ways, even if it's in ways that resemble Jesus. If it's not something I prefer, I'm going to go to my favorite elder or minister and I'm going to tell him, I'm a significant member of this church family and I don't like that this is happening. And it can be very difficult for church leadership prior to, not only does there need to be preparation for a congregation for change, there has to be preparation within a leadership. What are we going to say when this happens? How are we going to handle these kinds of threats?
The leadership needs to be unified.
Because most of our institutions are struggling more than they used to, which makes all of us institutionally anxious. And if we get to the place where we can't do what we think Christ is asking us to do because someone might leave, or 15% of our congregation might leave, and we stop moving, at that point, we're not leading.
Why do you want those members anyhow?
I just want their money.
Send them to Stephenville.
No. Yeah. No, I agree. But especially as preachers, right? We feel responsible for the rest of the staff. We feel responsible for how all of that's going, and it can be very difficult to have that courage.
Yeah, it is difficult, and I don't want to come off as we just kick people out and tell them bye. We do say bye, but again, you have to have a certain expectation. You got to expect people to grow up. If your expectation is low, if you expect them to be coddled, then that's what they're going to do. If you expect them to grow up, they will rise up and meet your expectations. And I just believe that because I've seen it happen.
Yeah.
I've seen that done, where you expect people to grow spiritually and you hold them accountable. And people tend to do that. I have a fundamental belief that when you teach Christians to do Christian things, Christians will do Christian things. Mm-hmm. They will behave like Christians. But by and large, you just got to expect them to do it.
You know, we have people here from very small congregations and medium size and fairly large congregations, maybe several hundred people. And back to what I was saying earlier, it's difficult to apply the same standard to everybody, because if you're in a small town and the town is declining and you're gradually losing members either to death or moving away or whatever, what does faithfulness look like in that environment? We need to say that. We need to make it overt. What does faithfulness look like?
There's a danger in what we're talking about that concerns me, that oftentimes what we're talking about is staying alive as an individual church, or even as, dare I say, denomination. Mm-hmm. Our first priority is Christ and his mission, and it's about kingdom business. And I think we need to keep coming back to that. You know, whether you're talking about in a small town that the church has almost gone away, or whether we're talking about a 3,000 member congregation, it needs to be that priority. And we need to be thinking about, okay, how can I best do kingdom business? And sometimes churches need to figure out how to close their doors and move on, keeping with the mission. You know, join with those that they can join with, plant churches. You know, that sometimes that's what needs to be done. Now that's hard language to say, but we need to back up and think about, okay, what's the number one priority? Is the number one priority keeping our doors open, or is it figuring out how we can best fit into that mission that we've been given by our King to do kingdom business?
I know of a congregation that decided to disband, and the congregations do have life cycles. We need to admit that.
Right.
And environmental factors around profoundly affect that. But the sweet thing is they use their assets to do the very thing you're talking about, David. They use their assets to forward the kingdom and the purposes of the kingdom, and had a significant impact. And so there's silver linings, I guess you might say, to this.
And one thing we might need to look into more, and in the mergers that I was involved in, they were healthy situations where two healthy congregations are working together. But that's something we need to explore more, I think, in dealing with, you know, congregations that are just struggling and limping along. And frankly, I'll say this, you all may disagree, but whether you were ever really going to merge or not, it is healthy for every eldership to have to sit down with another eldership and think through, what would we do if we were going to start a new congregation together? What would be our purpose? What would we be about? What would we keep? What would we throw away? That's worthwhile to do for any group, whether it ever ends up in a merger or not. And some of these small congregations need to look at some places where they can be built up by joining forces with other churches. And there may be some differences that they need to learn to work through together that will make them healthier in the long run.
Okay.
I think Todd Woodruff and Stan Grenberg in their study, the Church of Christ 2050, talked about that's part of the reason they felt like the churches of Christ were in decline, because of a lack of congregations, or the congregations who are struggling but just trying to hold on for the sake of holding on. They recommended, it would be wise to go ahead and perhaps in certain circumstances to close your doors, join in the effort with someone else. I've seen this congregation do this just here recently. I went home to visit in Dallas, and the church where I was baptized. I went there and noticed that the sign was off the building, and I felt a certain kind of way, sad and thinking this church has died out. And I was really surprised by this congregation, by that fact. Come to find out that they did close their doors, but they planted themselves somewhere else.
Yeah.
It was just wise to do so. Yeah. So you see that happening, and maybe that is something that you need to do.
We have also what I call autonomy gone to seed, or excessive autonomy, sense of autonomy. There is no overarching organization higher than the local congregation. And I understand where that comes from, New Testament, this type of thing. But what it produces inadvertently sometimes are little islands that have no communication with one another and no degree of cooperation.
Yeah, we become Sparta. We become Sparta. We're closed, we're tight, we have a defensive mode, and Sparta dies out eventually.
I'm not pushing back on the focus on individual congregations holding on just to hold on. But I will say, regardless of the size of your congregation, one of the things that I think we have to wrestle with in terms of a future and being faithful is I'm 40 years old. I grew up in the Churches of Christ. My dad's a preacher. The primary model that I have in my mind of what church is an educational model. And community was secondary to that. It was that a community was formed because we were coming together to learn true things about God. And I'm concerned as we think about going forward, because of the advent of the internet and technology, if the church's primary reason for existing in any town is that people are going to come to you for the truth, I got to tell you, they've got that at their fingertips every moment of every day. Even if all they want to do is listen to Church of Christ preaching, they've got just untold hours of that already available to them. And so one of the things that I think we've all got to start to wrestle with is how would we flip that where community is primary and education is secondary, which to me feels very different from what I grew up doing and what we're trying to do at Southern Hills even. Mm-hmm. And it's so tempting to think that if something's wrong with the church, let's do a sermon series, let's do a Bible study, let's do something that we're going to educate our way out of this. When I think for a lot, especially millennials, I think of times when we were really at churches that I would call the community there toxic, but we were willing to put up with toxic community for the truth. Well, people aren't going to do that anymore. And so I think we've really got to wrestle with what are we doing when we gather together as the people of God that's participatory enough and where people know they're needed enough that they can't download that experience and have it be the same. Because if they can convince themselves, they will. And we have really got to think through, I think, what does that mean going forward?
I think you're right. And it's not necessarily the style of our worship, that we're talking about, but it needs to be a celebration. We've been out in the trenches during the week, serving the community, being involved in people's lives, building up our brothers and sisters, and we come together for celebration, and encouragement, like Hebrews 10. Yeah, we're telling our stories of the victories we've had in the world, the change that we're making. My understanding of 1 Corinthians 14 is that Paul was saying, you worship together to lift up God, lift up each other, and when somebody comes in from the outside, they're lifted up to say, man, God is here. That's what our worship needs to be. And if we do that, people are going to want to come. If it's just to hear me preach, as much as I think I'm a great preacher, that probably is not going to draw people in. But if it's a celebration where they're saying, man, something is going on here, and it has to be God, I think they'll want to come back.
It's a celebration, and then for those who are within the church, Christianity is a generational component, and to where you need to have our younger people as well who have some buy-in to what we're doing. You mentioned it being participatory in some shape, form, or fashion. So they're not just showing up because you drugged them to church, all right? I don't know about you all, but I got a whooping if I didn't go to church. My last whooping at 16 was because I missed a Wednesday night services.
Oh, man, I wouldn't have had you on the panel if I'd have known that.
Right. But when you have them involved, we kind of talked about this before, if you have, intentionally involving your younger people, they're training, they're being trained, they're being expected to participate in the life of the church in some shape, form, or fashion. And not just our youth, but every member of the congregation comes in with an expectation that you're going to grow up spiritually, you're going to be able to share your faith in some form, whether it's in a Bible school class or whether it's on your job, you're doing mission work out in your real world.
The final question is going to be, I'll give you a little advance notice here. What can we do to win back the millennials and the boomers into our churches? But before I do that, the research by Granberg and Woodruff also revealed that tweaks that we typically do in a church, if we just had a younger preacher, we could attract the young people. If we just did this, if we just did that, their research shows that all of these, I hate to say gimmicks, all of these procedures didn't move the needle at all. Is that your experience?
Correct. And they mentioned two things that really stood out to me, that we have evangelistic laryngitis.
Yeah, I love that. I love that term, evangelistic laryngitis. Yeah.
Part of the reason our congregations are not growing is because we're not going. We're not teaching people the gospel. Dare I ask, when was the last time you taught someone the gospel of Jesus Christ and they made a decision to obey the gospel and become a part of the Lord's church? When was the last time you did that? Right? So we have evangelistic laryngitis. Another issue that they pointed out was the church polity, the makeup of the leadership, elder-driven church opposed to a team concept with the evangelists and the elders. For instance, I am not a pulpit preacher. I'm not a full pulpit preacher. I am the evangelist of the Ministry Church of Christ. I work in cohesion with the elders of our congregation. We have a strong eldership and a strong evangelist. So our model is different than some. And maybe that's part of the reason why, when we first started this session or this conference today, the slide said that these are the white churches of Christ that are declining. All right. One, I just have trouble with the fact that we have a white church of Christ. So I guess we also have a black church of Christ, and so on and so forth. That shouldn't be, but we know it is. But even with that, I'm still not in a black church. I attend a multicultural congregation. So where do we fit in? It's 60% African Americans and 25% white and about 10 or 12% Hispanic and so on. So where do we fit in? But because so our congregation is not necessarily, I don't know, it's just one congregation, but I could probably speak of several others, not necessarily declining. One, because it's evangelistic, right? So we just baptized our 17th individual last Sunday for the year, 17. Out of those 17 individuals, that's about 26 people altogether, their children as well as coming to the congregation. And of those 26, 14 of those are non-African Americans, right? So we're just trying to do what the Bible tells us to do. Go ye therefore and teach all nations. That's white people and black people and short people and tall people. and we're trying to teach them to grow up spiritually, right? That's what we're supposed to do. We grow up in all things so that they can, in turn, make disciples and do the same thing. And we try to hold them to that.
Mid Street Church, long time been a model for the multicultural church. Certainly for the Abilene area.
It started off that way, and Dr. Roach is here, who established the congregation there in the back. He would readily say this as well. He had to have someone come in and say, "You're being a racist because you're only taking the gospel to black people." When we have gospel meeting, you walk around the white people and give a card to the black person and say, "Hey, come to our meeting." Right? And perhaps somebody need to come to your congregation and say, "You're being racist," because you're not teaching the gospel to all people. Right? Propinquity is running wild with our people. Bless our hearts.
Yep. Amen, brother. Thank you.
Let me comment on that. There's one term that I would disagree with some of the things that have been said about the younger generations losing interest and not wanting to participate in church activities. Part of that may be the way we're defining church activities. What I'm finding is when you present ways in which they can be engaged in serving, they can be engaged in social justice, they can be involved in ending racism, when they can do something because they're doers, and they will get involved.
And they will go to the hard places too, won't they?
And I think that's part of the difference.
Yeah.
That they get excited about things where they can see there's results, that they can actually contribute. And I think that's a key to our future of getting involvement in that. One of the things we did at Vacation Bible School this year was to sing Spanish songs. And it was interesting because the kids who were there that were with Latino backgrounds, they were speakers of English. They could sing the songs in English. But their parents who were showing up and watching and trying to decide whether they wanted their kids to be involved in our church or not were just awestruck by the idea that we were singing some songs in Spanish. Yeah. And there were young families with young children who want to be involved. And I loved seeing how our young parents got involved.
That's great.
In that relationship. Yeah. And they couldn't understand each other for the most part.
Yeah.
But they still showed love to each other. Oh. And some of those relationships continue because they can sink their teeth into that.
Yeah. Jarrod?
Yeah, this doesn't belong to me, but just this idea that we've got to get serious about offering a whole gospel for the whole person. That every time in our church, and our Southern Hills is trying really intentionally to focus on a 1-mile mission focus around our church building, which happens to be populated by people who don't look very much like the people who go to our church, right? Most of us are driving in to church and past that neighborhood. But one of the things we found in doing that is every time we talk about meeting basic needs in that neighborhood, I get pulled aside. It's not always the same person, but someone will tell me, hey, our job is to save people's souls. This stuff you're talking about, this social justice stuff, that's not the church's job. And I don't know why we're talking about it. That's for the Salvation Army, that's for that's for someone else to do. And when we do that, we are denying what Jesus plainly models in his ministry, which is he has a whole gospel for the whole person. And it's not that he's only serving people and not also sharing good news about God with them. He's always doing both. And I think for a long time, for whatever reason in our heritage, we have tried to create some clean category between caring for somebody's soul and the rest of their bodily needs or their life. And if the world can't tell, and if younger people can't tell, and I don't know if it's just younger people, I think it's unchurched people. If they don't believe your church is a blessing to their community, they're not interested. They're not interested. And if we're going to have any future going forward, we have to reintegrate this idea of Jesus doesn't just preach to people. If he's preaching to hungry people, he feeds them. We've got to model that as as living representatives of his ministry.